Hello vinyl community, this is Mike with TCAT's Deep Vinyl Tracks, and I wanted to come on today to show you some more records that I found at some antique malls here in the Edmonton area. And let's just get right to it, because there's a few here I want to go through. First one here is Pavlovs Dog. This is the album called Pampered Menial from 1975. This is their first album, and they are a progressive rock band. This particular album did quite well on the charts and was originally released by ABC Records. And but once it fell off the charts, it was reissued by Columbia, and it went right back on the charts again, this time with a different album cover. And I kind of think people got a little bit confused and ended up buying two copies of the same album because of that. But great band if you haven't heard them, Pavlovs Dog. And if you love progressive rock, then you probably already know about them, but if not, then I highly recommend them for people that love progressive rock. Picked up finally a copy of The Police, Ghost and Machine. Had this one quite a while ago, and finally got it back in the collection. So now I've only got one studio album left from The Police to pick up. This one was released in 1981, and I didn't know this at first. Somewhere along the way I learned, but these three images on the front are actually the three band members. You got Sting, and I'm not sure which one is which on the others, but if you look at them close, you can see they're actually faces. So I always thought that was kind of cool. This one's a rarity from Vangelis. Hard to tell that because it's got his full name on there. But this was an album released back in 1981. Not an easy one to find. It's actually a soundtrack. And don't ask me to pronounce the name of the movie that it's from. Here, let me see if I can get a better shot of the label here. But what it translates to is, do you hear the dogs barking? From 1975, it is a soundtrack. It was released later in 1977 under the name Ignacio, I think is how you pronounce that. But the movie itself is a Mexican drama. Very glad to get that one because I know that's not an easy one to find out there. Next I have, yes, his second album, Time and a Word. This is from the year 1970, and this is not the original cover that they came out with. This was the censored cover that was released in America because they apparently didn't like the nude drawing that was on the original album in the UK. Interesting thing is Peter Banks was one of the original members of Yes, and he was not in the band when this picture was taken, but he was in the band when the album was released. So in place of Peter Banks, they got oh man, Steve Howe. That's terrible. I can never remember his name when it comes down to it. Steve Howe, the more famous guitarist from the later band that would show up on the third album, but he is not on this particular album, even though his picture is there. On the back cover, you have a picture of Peter Banks instead of Steve Howe. So, interesting little bit of trivia for Yes collectors. Next, I got the album The Del Fuegos. Now, I had this album a while back and got rid of it somewhere along the way. Glad to get this one back in. I've been looking for it for quite a while. But the name of the album is Boston, Mass. The Del Fuegos is kind of a garage rock, roots rock type band. One of the members, when this one was released and for their first 3 albums, was a guy named Warren Zanes. Warren Zanes is actually a good friend, was a good friend of Tom Petty, and wrote Tom Petty's biography which is entitled Petty. I just read that biography, actually. It was a very good book if you're looking for a good biography written about Tom Petty. Of course, it doesn't cover his later years. It was printed before Tom Petty's death, unfortunately. But anyway, this is about the Del Fuegos, and another great band that gets overlooked quite a bit. This is what the back of it looks like. And it's on the Warner Brothers / label. So good to have that one back finally after all these years. Next up is Gentle Giant, The Missing Piece. Of course, Gentle Giant is a great progressive band that later turned to adjusted their sound to meet more of the 1980s sound. This particular album is kind of a transition album for them. It was released in 1977 and was their 9th album. The first side of the album actually has several different varying styles, while the second side is more of their tried and true progressive sound. So they were kind of adjusting their sound. It was to be the last Gentle Giant album that would chart. So that kind of tells you something. They lost, instead of gaining more fans like they were hoping to do, they ended up losing their fans when they changed their sound. Next up, we have Leonard Skinner's Street Survivors. Pretty much everybody knows the story behind this album, but quickly, this album was released, and then 3 days later, the horrific plane crash where 3 of the Leonard Skinner's band members were killed. One of them was Ronnie Van Zant, who was the lead singer. Also, the others that were killed in the crash were Steve Gaines. This would be the only album that Steve Gaines would play guitar on, and unfortunately died quickly after the release. And his sister Cassie Gaines, she was one of the backup singers for the band. There were several members that were also seriously injured because of this, and Leonard Skinner unfortunately dissolved after that. They tried getting back together but could never get the success that they had before the plane crash. Alan Collins, who was one of the band members, was seriously injured and was supposed to have had his arm amputated because of the crash, but fortunately he was able to heal. His father was against getting it amputated, and it turned out to be the right move in his case. Next up we have Japan, and this is the album Tin Drum. This would be the last Japan studio album that would be put out, and it's also probably one of the most revered out of all their albums. Richard Barbieri, who was the keyboardist for Japan and later became the keyboardist for Porcupine Tree, said this was their most innovative album and probably one of the most satisfying albums that they did. Highly recommended album by Japan, Tin Drum. Next up, I really loved The Art of Noise, and used to have all their albums. Unfortunately, those ended up having to be sold, so I finally got a copy back into my collection, Who's Afraid of The Art of Noise. This is their debut album, and very good album. It has 3 of their big hits on it: Moments in Love, close to the beat, and beatbox. Close to the edit, and beatbox were three big hits that they had, and all three of those are on this particular release. If you're looking to get into the art of noise, highly recommend this album. Very great band that I really love. Next up is John Cale, Music for a New Society. This album marks a big change for John Cale. He was moving away, at least on his solo albums, he was moving away from a rock-oriented sound to a more experimental sound, which is what he accomplishes with this one. Again, this was a very well-liked album by the critics, but it is considered one of his best. But it does get into experimental territory, so I'm not sure how well that went over with the public, but great album nonetheless. Actually, it was a commercial failure. I wrote that down in my notes. Later became one of the one of his most popular albums nowadays, and that popularity still continues. I know John Cale is very happy with that album too. Next up I have the Blasters. This is the album Hardline from 1985. This would be their fourth album, and it would also be the last with Dave Alvin, who was the lead songwriter and singer. Of course, if you don't know, the Blasters is a roots rock band. Really love their music. Kind of has that rockabilly sensibility to it. And it has been said that Dave Alvin is probably one of the most underappreciated lyricists in pop music. So glad to have that one in. Been working on trying to get some of the Blasters albums, so that's a good one to get. Next up we have Cream, Will of Fire. Of course, this is the band with Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, and Eric Clapton. This is in really good shape. I don't have it in plastic yet since it is a gatefold like this. But this has both the studio album and the live album with it. I know they were released separately at one time, but I think most copies come with both albums. So this is a good one to add to my collection. Next one is from Creedence Clearwater Revival, Cosmos Factory. I already have a copy of this, but it's not a very good copy. This one, as you can see, is like pristine condition. The jacket is perfect. The record itself is perfect. It's that reproduced blue fantasy label. But just nice to have a beautiful copy of that one. Was happy to get this. This is Graham Parsons and the Flying Burrito Brothers. This is called Sleepless Nights. Now, this isn't really an album per se as much as it is a collection of outtakes. But 9 of the songs on this album come from an album that the Flying Burrito Brothers were going to release and never did because Graham Parsons ended up breaking away from the group. And there are also 3 outtakes from his solo album Grievous Angel on this too. So I know this one has really been a hard one to find, for me at least. So I'm glad to finally get a good copy of that. And again, in really good shape. So this one is an Italian progressive band. Most people that know anything about progressive Italian rock will know it's Premiata Fornaria Marconi, which translated into English means award-winning Marconi Bakery. Now, where they come up with that name, I'm not sure, but this is their 1975 album, Chocolate Kings. This album is unique in that it's the first album where all the lyrics were originally written in English. A lot of times they would write their lyrics in Italian, and if they wanted it to be an English song or sung in English, they would translate it from Italian into English. This would be the first time they were originally written in English for the album. They're also the first Italian band to have international success. Alan Parsons Project. This one is Vulture Culture. So I'm on my way to almost getting all of the Alan Parsons albums. Of course, some I like better than others, but this one is a pretty good one. It didn't quite sell quite as well as some of their other albums, but this one was released in 1985 and is Alan Parsons' 8th album. It actually charted quite well over in Europe, but didn't do so well in the US. I showed this one on a previous video, but this was also among those Antique Mall finds that I got. This is Fred Frith, Speechless. Fred Frith was one of the founding members of the band Henry Cow that was around, a progressive band back in the 70s. This particular album is Fred Frith's 3rd solo album and was released in 1981. Fred Frith also played with the Art Bears and also appears on several of the Residents albums. And the interesting thing is it comes on Ralph Records, which is the Residents' own label. And this is quite an experimental album. It has quite a variety of music styles on it. You go from folk to avant-garde to noise rock. You got a lot of everything on this. And Fred Frith is a very experimental guitarist. So this particular album is highly revered by the critics, and many consider it his best album, and he has quite a few albums out there, so that's actually saying quite a lot. Also picked up a copy of The Kings. The Kings Are Here. This album is made up of, well, the band is made up of Canadians. They're all Canadian musicians. And this was the only album they released that had a hit that charted in both the US and Canada. It's got a really cool label. And they're kind of a power pop, I guess you would call it. Kind of an alternative rock style. The hit that they had was actually a duo hit. There were 2 songs actually stuck together, and it was called This Beat Goes On and Switchin' to Glide. I know Switchin' to Glide has been used for different sporting events and different sporting theme songs, so kind of a fun one to have. Outlaws, Ghost Riders. This is from 1980, and it's their 6th studio album. This would be the album that would kind of rejuvenate their career, as it has the hit Ghost Riders in the Sky on it. But on this particular album, they kind of changed up their style. Well, they didn't really change up their style. They just stopped focusing so much on the southern rock aspect and focused more towards the hard rock aspect of their music. So, nice copy of that one. I like early albums by the Scorpions, and everything from Blackout and before, I think, are actually great albums. This one was their 3rd album, called In Trance from 1975, and it is also their first album to be censored. This is the uncensored version. It's kind of hard to see with the glare, but on the later versions of it, The breasts were kind of, what do you call it, airbrushed out off the cover, so you couldn't see that. But it was the first album cover. Of course, they're notorious for their album covers. It was the first one to be censored. Even so, this is a great album, even though it features shorter tracks than what their first two albums had. Still got some great music on it, and I love their unpolished sound that they had back in the day when this one was out. So, great one to have back in. Brian from the Embryonic Robot will be proud about this one. They're happy to see that I finally got a copy of Organization by Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. This is their second album, and it's probably one of their more dark and melancholic albums on the Virgin label. Mike Hallett, I found this interesting. Mike Hallett was from the band Gong, was brought in to produce this album, and again, one that didn't fare so well as far as sales go, but the critics actually loved it a lot. So, and this album was never formally released in the U.S. that I'm aware of. They instead did kind of a compilation style album in place of this one. So this is a good one to get into my collection as I'm trying to work on building up my OMD records. Last but not least, we got Judas Priest, Sad Wings of Destiny. I just like the Scorpions. I love Judas Priest's early albums. I love the vocals on these albums. His vocals have always been great anyway. But again, more of an unpolished sound, which is the sound that I really enjoy a lot more than I do the 80s, the later 80s polished sound. So this is another great one to have. It's on an interesting label, Ovation Records. And from 1976, like I said, it's the second album. Even though it's got more of a variety on it than some of their later albums would have, it still leans a lot towards the heavy rock sound. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed seeing that. And again, as usual, I went way over time. But I have a lot more albums to show from thrift store finds too. So those will be coming up later. But as for now, thank you for watching, and we will talk to you later.